All right. Well, welcome to Schelling Point, Juan. Thanks so much for joining us. How does it feel to see this vision of bringing all of crypto to Argentina? How does it feel to see that come to fruition?
It's awesome. Thank you for coming. and just like really explore and get to know the community here, get to know the city, get to feel like what it's like. I've been loving the posts on Twitter with all of the pictures of like beautiful Buenos Aires with like the jacaranda trees, which is funny because in Mexico we say jacaranda, but it's really jacaranda, right? Yeah, that's super cool. It's been beautiful to see people get excited about the city and get excited about all the crypto native stuff. And so, yeah, thank you for coming and consider staying or coming in next year.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I've enjoyed my time here. And, I'm wondering if we could shift the focus from Argentina to Ethereum and crypto in general. What's your state of the ecosystem right now? Where do you think we are? What are the growth areas that you're really excited about? And kind of like, what's your thesis? What are the bets that you're placing right now?
Yeah. I think the crypto ecosystem is maturing a lot. We just had a bull market cycle, and it was the sanest, most disciplined, most focused on like creating real value for real users bull market I've seen in the entire history of crypto. So that is awesome. Like way less random nonsense being peddled. And so that like way less emphasis on the casino. Like the casino, I think, is less of the mind share. And that's been fantastic. I think people are realizing that the industry as a whole is now starting to optimize for creating significant value flows for the world at large. And so that now it's putting in place the optimization conditions where projects that focus on that can really succeed. There was a real problem in crypto about 4 years ago exactly, but like around that bull market and like the 2 years before and 2 years after, where the things that succeeded in the market were more about narratives and or like just purely just narratives without like the underlying value flows actually being figured out. And that put an optimization pressure on teams to focus on that as opposed to focus on the underlying kind of integrity and value flow of the system. And so it's been great to see now kind of like a rearrangement towards that. Like the deep end space, for example, is like now super focused on like what revenue is this thing making? Is like your OpEx lower than the revenue cost? Like are you kind of taking some amount of time to grow, but you're very keenly aware of like your revenue flows and you're focused on that and so on. So I think like there's a whole set of possibilities there. I think where we're placing a lot of bets include, so maybe mention a few categories. So one is we have a whole focus area around securing the internet and establishing digital human rights. So this means secure communications infrastructure, secure data distribution, censorship persistence, like all of the cypherpunk vision type stuff of being able to build digital infrastructure that protects our rights. The second is in upgrading economies and governance systems. So this means using crypto to build better economic primitives or extend existing economic primitives to more people around the world that maybe don't have access to them. Being able to do things like the whole DeSci movement fits into this. The whole public goods funding movement fits into this. We think there's an enormous amount of value in creating new kinds of mechanisms for the allocation of capital, both in private and public good contexts. This is where like Gitcoin and Allo, for example, are like we're super excited about everything that you, Kevin, and the whole Gitcoin and Allo communities have been building. There's a whole possibility space around pop-up cities and network states and all of these kinds of ideas, which are kind of applying some of these primitives into actual societal contexts where they have significant political impact. And so those are like I think really interesting domains. I think this second category is less mature commercially relative to the first one. So the first one, in terms of securing the internet, you see a lot of blockchains focused on building kind of transactional infrastructure and building privacy primitives and building kind of like it's just easier to find like the specific product market fit landscape. I think in this other kind of upgrading economies and governance systems question, the products and the customer sets are harder to kind of distill and understand. And I think the community has been slower to finding strong product market fit that unlocks a big cash flow. So my strong advice for everybody building in this space is like, you have to find structures that are deeply regenerative, where the cost structure that you have for providing the service is just a small fraction of the revenue flow that you can cause. And that's what creates a very strong, fast feedback loop that enables your thing to grow quickly to be able to satisfy users globally. Like if you think about, what it took to scale internet access globally, it is only because they had a very cheap way of providing the service and a large revenue flow that they were able to compound that into being able to build out infrastructure for billions of people globally. If that margin was very, very small, then they would the rollout would have been dramatically slower. And so for the public goods builders, like just figure out how to create large improvements, really solve people's problems, have a very clear sense of who the customer segments are, and figure out some way of routing a fraction of the capital you're helping allocate back into the system itself to improve it. And if you can do that well, then you'll scale fairly quickly.
Yeah, Devansh and I took an idea from Vitalik and published it on the ETH Research Forum 6 or 9 months ago, something called fair fees, where basically for public goods builders, you would basically take more of a fee from the platforms that you're administrating at lower amounts, and there's sort of like a quadratic curve in which you take less fees more time. And that basically solves for the problem of public goods builders being able to take actual revenue and pay for their upfront costs early, but then not capturing too much of the slice of pie as things scale. Do you think something like that is the right model? And if not, is there another proposed way that like crowdfunding platforms like Gitcoin and Giveth and Clearfund should be thinking about funding themselves?
I think that's a really cool idea. And I think structures like that have credible mechanisms that it, just apply directly are really neat ideas. The thing to be careful about though is I just see so many teams vastly underestimating the cost structure involved in actually building anything. It just takes a lot of time and energy and resources to do it. And you need to be able to fund teams to be able to do it. And every additional market segment that you unlock, every additional order of magnitude of users that you unlock comes along with a very large cost. So it's very difficult to set those parameters up front to understand what is the scale of revenue flow that you'll need to actually grow to provide a service globally. Now you might not need to provide a service globally. You might be able to create something that is smaller or medium sized, and you kind of level off, and then you inspire somebody else to go do the other thing. But I don't know, these days, like you can have massive global reach fairly quickly with a product. Just make sure that you understand the cost structure of what that's going to require and set those parameters well. So I do think that these experiments are really good to do, and the more we can kind of enshrine in smart contracts and kind of like experiment at scale, the better it'll go. I just see a lot of public goods funding type ideas getting stuck in, so we have the smart contracts, but let's also create all this other legal framework and structuring outside of the smart contract that then creates a ton of red tape anyway. And it's kind of like the thing that feels like the right thing to do because that's how the legal world works. But I think it's just adding a ton of red tape that makes it harder to then evolve the system directly on chain. So my strong recommendation to a lot of groups is like do almost everything you possibly can entirely on chain so that you can leverage the digital kind of upgrading system that you get from a blockchain. Like the real power here doesn't just come from the fact that you have, blockchain that can process things. It comes from the fact that you're using computers to represent the legal landscape and the economic landscape. And you have a credible transactional processing system that will enforce the rules. And so don't slow yourself down by then taking your 21st century technology and dumping in for 1700s or earlier technology because you feel like you're told like that's what you should do. It's like, no. Like the real promise here, the real promise of this entire industry is to move into a fully digital landscape. And sure, you have to create adapters to the regular world, but you can't like replicate your entire structures because then like you're leaving all the benefits of being digital on the table.
Yeah, I love that. I'm wondering if we could talk about the public goods funding space, however you would define that. I'm wondering if you could kind of give us a snapshot of within Web3 public goods funding, where you think we are now and where we're going. And what are the trends? And obviously you already mentioned revenue and actually taking revenue for your products. And I think that's important, but what else would you add to that?
So I think maybe when a lot of this started 7 years ago, it was kind of like early days. We had the blockchain systems, but we didn't have a lot of ideas of what to do. Like, we had some ideas, but we hadn't fully explored the landscape of possibility. And so I think we've done that. I think in the last 5-7 years, we've come up with a ton of really good ideas of what to do. I think, and we've had a number of projects and systems and programs build up fairly large scale versions of this. Like, Gitcoin has processed, I don't know, 50, 100 million, 50, 70,
70, yeah.
$70 million worth of grants. Like, that's amazing. That like is comparable to like nation states. Like, there are some nation states that haven't processed that amount of grant funding in that amount of time. So like, that's like a huge, awesome result. And we did it entirely, on chain, with a whole bunch of coordination, with lots of groups participating, with quadratic funding. Like, that's super cool. The Optimism Retro PGF, like similar sort of scale funding flows. The Falcon community is moving its kind of capital allocation, policy capital allocation, which was in like traditional, 20th century grant making through email, into on-chain primitives. And so like, we'll soon join that illustrious club. And it's like, that's pretty good, like pretty well-sized experiments. However, we need to get the product landscape to be dramatically better. I think like it's still very difficult to run these experiments. It's still kind of clunky. It feels like high friction to set up these things up. I think AI here can help a lot. Like, we can vibe code a lot of the interfaces and a lot of the tools. I think we can get a lot closer to taking a bunch of these ideas we've generated and then producing high quality products that enable these to be diffused. And so kind of where I think the PGF space is that we have now produced a lot of ideas. We have a few examples of it working at scale. We haven't figured out the revenue flow story, and like that's kind of like the next one. And we need to figure out how to translate more of these ideas that we have into primitives that people can actually use with their systems on chain and so on.
Yeah, I mean, I think that plurality of the exploration of the design space has been one of the things that's most exciting to me right now. I think of like quadratic funding and retro funding and DeepGov as being different tools that solve this problem in a different way. It's almost like we're developing this toolkit of on-chain native public goods funding tooling that it's almost like, one of them is a hammer and another is a screwdriver and the other is a plier. They solve different problems, but they can be used to construct things together. And so I guess like my feeling is that we're moving to this plural design space in which you have a bunch of mechanisms that do one thing and do them well. And yeah, maybe there should be some sort of unified interface or way to integrate all of them together. But it sounds like from the Filecoin perspective, you guys are looking to deploy multiple of these in the Filecoin ecosystem. Could you talk about, what's the plan for the Filecoin public goods funding?
And maybe I'll talk about both Filecoin and PL. So Filecoin is further along. PL is a little bit behind. Filecoin currently has, over the last year, we've implemented two major PGF mechanisms on chain. We have a Phil Retro PGF program and a Phil Pro PGF program, in the prospective version. That's otherwise known as a grants program, however, on chain, and similarly using kind of a batch holder set to help select. We also want to experiment with some of the like deep funding style ideas of being able to use these like AI competition type structures, and experiment with like the drips and like early Gitcoin ideas around and source code ideas around doing distribution across the entire dependency graph. Those are kind of upcoming experiments in the Falcon community. We are also figuring out what it looks like to create a mechanism that collects all the PGF funding for Filecoin and then routes it to these mechanisms. That's one of the reasons I'm super excited about Gitcoin 3.3. Is that how you say it? 3.3? 3.3? 3.3?
Yeah, 3.0 is where we are now. 3.3 is where we're going. Yeah.
Yeah. So one of the reasons I'm super excited about 3.3 is you're experimenting directly with structures for how do you like govern those mechanisms and decide which ones to use, and create an experimental framework that enables people to like suggest and build new versions of these. And so that I see as like, great stuff for 2026 for us to kind of build more of these mechanisms, figure out how to route to them, figure out how to evaluate the impact that they're producing, to then decide how much funding each of these should get. And then on PL side, we've done a lot of public goods funding, but that's been traditional grants type structures. we're just now starting to think about, great, let's take some of these learnings from all of these on-chain mechanisms and start building some structures for PL itself as a whole network to be able to fund the early stages of the R&D pipeline using some of these on-chain systems. That's kind of, again, very early. That might be late in 26 when we start putting in those mechanisms. Might end up being 27. It'd be great if we do it in 26. If folks here are interested in helping us do all this stuff, like we're always keen to collaborate on all these ideas and trying different mechanisms.
Great. Yeah, I'd love to shift the focus from PL and Filecoin over to Gitcoin. And I think you and I have been friends for years since I wrote the Green Pill book, and it's been great to get to know you guys. And I think that you've seen our arc over time, going from quadratic funding to many mechanisms. And then I'd say that we were caught on our back foot on two things as the ecosystem moved from quadratic funding to other mechanisms, and then also as there's more of a focus on revenue. And I think that 3.0 to 3.3 like is our goal to actually have some sort of sustainable business model and also respond to this plurality of mechanisms. But I'm wondering if you can respond to what you know about the 3.0 arc and the play that we're making here. I mean, I think that this is kind of, Gitcoin's got like $16 million in treasury left. Half of that is for public goods and half of that is for, the DAO. And like if you were me, or if you were one of the top governance delegates, what would you do? If you could just respond to how we can adapt to this latest era, I think that would be great.
Yeah, thanks for the prompt. I have a ton of thoughts, and I say all of this with an enormous amount of admiration for everything the Gitcoin community has been able to build. Like, so much of the infrastructure that we use across the whole ecosystem was pioneered or supported by or like enhanced by the Gitcoin community, and especially the discussion evolved a ton. So I think major successes that the Gitcoin community has had includes like this entire program structure that's repeatable, that enables like lots of participants to get involved, and then you try something, and then you see kind of the outputs, and then you have this learning framework. Like, that's awesome. Like, the fact that we're doing this and that we're also evolving Gitcoin itself with the versioning is super, super good, and creates a path for Gitcoin to evolve and keep up with, changes in the space, changes in the market, changes in what we're understanding from what the impact is being. One of the things that I would love to see as a significant shift is to see a range of the projects that are getting very early funding from Gitcoin be able to give back some amount of the wealth that they're going to create back into Gitcoin. And it should not be this kind of like grants round fundraising dance that has to happen every round, where like the Gitcoin community has to come to these projects and say, hey, like, do you want to come and donate some amount of money back to public goods to help like the ecosystem? And invariably, because those conversations turn into what is like the kind of business development or marketing budget for those groups right now, and how does Gitcoin fit into that business development budget? And that's not the point. The point is this project got early stage funding from the Gitcoin community, from this public goods pool, in order to succeed. And so this funding should in some way be able to get repaid back into the public goods pool at some point. And so I don't know if it's like shifting into like recoverable grants of some type. That's kind of hard. Those instruments are difficult. I don't know if it's just creating a strong cultural expectation that groups get back. Universities fund tons of their operations through just the cultural expectation that the graduates of their universities should come back. The ones that like mega succeed and have a lot of wealth or whatever must come back and donate back to the university, because the university was crucial in their development. And so we should establish that norm in a community where those projects should go back and give back, not a fraction of their business development or marketing budgets, but like a sizable fraction as a thank you for supporting them in the very early days. This is equivalent to like early stage angel funding. There's a structure for it. There's like ways of pricing it. Like, we should have some avenue for that. And if we can create some mechanisms that enable kind of like some kind of structure like that to be applied, that would enable projects to like make Gitcoin, the Gitcoin pool of capital, legible to like the protocols or the cap tables of the companies that get developed after, such that like that kind of wealth creation can flow back into the entire PGF engine that Gitcoin 3.3 and beyond are building. And so I think something like that could be good. And that's kind of like more of like an aspirational goal. Very concretely, today on Gitcoin 3.3, the thing that I'm most excited about is this kind of evolutionary landscape of being able to create additional mechanisms and allocating capital with this kind of steering mechanism on top that can route funding to those mechanisms that are succeeding, and having kind of the evolutionary loop of letting that happen for a period of time, then seeing what the result was, and then adapting it in the next round. Like that's, I think, a super cool thing that I think is going to be very successful at enabling us to find better mechanisms and tuning the experience to fit and integrate with more ecosystems. So it's kind of like a very flexible structure that even enables some of those mechanisms to not just be a different mechanism idea, but it might be a different mechanism in a particular ecosystem or something like that. But ideally, we should be able to measure the impact globally, right? It could be that a neat experiment with a particular ecosystem ends up producing awesome public goods for like not just that ecosystem, but at large. And so I'm super excited about that in Gitcoin 3.3.
Yeah, great. Well, maybe I'll ask you one more question and then we'll open it up to the audience. So if you're out there in the audience, think of a question that you have for myself or Juan. My last question is super open-ended. Is there anything I didn't ask that you want to say?
I would think maybe one thing would be like, how do we get more participants? So in the PGS space, we have a ton of great ideas, a lot of collaboration around groups. We're all kind of struggling from being able to staff some of these efforts better. It requires sort of like dedicated focus. Like I think one of the difficult things in DAOs in general is having like the equivalent of like a management team in kind of traditional corporations. And so to me, it feels like the DAO community is like speed running. And we've talked about this in lots of like podcasts over time. Like we're sort of speed running the history of organizational development or corporation development and so on. And so there might be something here around enabling the community of PGF at large, or Gitcoin specifically, to experiment with like some of these management structures and how can they be built, and how could we experiment with that in a way that like enables a group to move faster towards some goals while preserving the DAO primitives of being able to have like broad alignment. Disruption Joe gave a great talk at the Phil Dev Summit where we talked about it. We had a PGF track that talked about structures for DAOs to be able to like align their goal sets and be able to like align what they're doing with like the broad goal sets and make sure that everyone's kind of rowing in the same direction. And so I think a lot of that is kind of like good management principles that we can employ into communities. So I would say like there's kind of like a meta process here of like evaluating how the DAO itself works and how do we improve the DAO itself. I'm less familiar with how that currently happens in Gitcoin, but I would encourage a lot of kind of good experimentation there with this evolutionary landscape of understanding what worked, what's strong, what do we keep, what do we give up, what new experiments do we try.
Yeah. I mean, my response to that is when we first made Gitcoin a DAO, I felt very strongly that it needed to be a incredibly neutral platform and it needed to be a protocol and not a platform. I think that like the naively in 2021, what we kind of did was we took the corporation and we put it on chain, and we didn't truly like mirror a network-based structure. And so now with 3.0, there's very few full-time employees, in the network-based structure where we elevate everyone else, I think is more of a DAO-based structure. So that was at least one learning about how to do these things. And I think DAOs will continue to evolve over time. The LLC is like 300 years old, and or corporations are 300 years old, and DAOs are only 5 years old. So when people say they don't believe in DAOs, I say let them cook, let them evolve a little bit more.
Yeah, I totally agree. I don't take my comment as not believing in DAOs. I just mean let's experiment with the primitives that enable DAOs to succeed.
Yeah. Fuck yeah.
Yeah.
Questions from the audience? I think we have a time for one or two. I see one in the back over there. Just shout it out.
Yeah, I want to know how to address the pre-rider problem there. A lot of projects are willing to give because only others are willing to give, and then it ends up and no one gives at all. And that's kind of one of the main bottlenecks to actually getting anyone make it.
Great. The guy who I can't see, who sounds like Devansh Mehta, asked about the free rider problem. You want to take a swing at that?
Yeah. So I spent a lot of my time thinking about this sort of problem because it's a deep problem in science and R&D, and like that's one of the core areas that I'm focused on trying to solve. So a few thoughts. One is there are well-established game theoretic systems here that you can analyze and relate to and then find a good solution for. There might be a mechanism in the literature that fits exactly with like the current free rider problem, and then you can just apply it. What I would say is most projects are, and most people tend to be very fair, and they know in the early days how hard they have it and how helpful a little bit of capital is to their success. And they know in a very fair way that they should give something back. And the hard part is like having that conversation at that time and not, 10 years later where that fraction of money is now worth an enormous amount of money later. And then it just feels like something like hard to justify. The investment community figured this out centuries ago in the form of equity and in the form of like getting a valuation for the equity and taking a position on it. So the hard part though with grants is that they're kind of like non-dilutive for a reason, and that's kind of why folks seek them. And it's very difficult to price things very early, and it can feel like a mistake to take in like 10 or 20K at like a $1 million valuation. Like if you heard that as a startup, you would be like, this is weird and crazy. But in practice, if you look at some of the most successful companies in the last 20, 30 years, they made deals like that. Like YC was giving 20K for 7% to a whole range of the companies like, Stripe and Airbnb and like that whole range of groups. And it was totally worth it. And those founders would say, absolutely, YC was worth it. And so the question here is like, can we come up with a structure that Gitcoin projects or PGF projects at large can take, like it's compatible with their kind of organizational structures, compatible with their history, isn't going to mess up their future fundraising, that is truly fair, to the public goods funding providers and the project, and that in a portfolio approach down the road turns out to work, right? Because like at the end of the day, most of these projects aren't going to return capital, and that's in many cases because they shouldn't. They're just like public goods, and that's fine. Some of them will create some kind of private good revenue flow, and we'll be able to return capital back into the pool. And we just need to make sure that maths correctly. But I think something like that could be experimented with. One proposition would be, could we, in some of the Gitcoin 3.3 mechanisms, in some of the sub-mechanisms, experiment with different instruments and saying, hey, maybe this one is going to do like one type of recoverable grant, or one of them is just going to strongly encourage all participants to donate back in the future. And like, I don't know, we can try like 10 things, and then we see what happens 1, 2, 3 years out, and we see whether or not that succeeded. And we get feedback from everybody, from like those projects, the community at large, and so on like what worked.
Yeah, I think that one of the hard things about the venture space is that you don't find out for 3, 5, 7 years whether or not a bet has worked out, and it's just hard to iterate on that side, that timeline. I don't know if you have any reaction to that, but the venture scale, that feels like the big challenge there. And
especially as early as this, sometimes it can take longer. I mean, crypto is nicer because the timelines are compressed. If you were doing this in, I don't know, neurotech, it's like a 20-year return cycle, wow. Like 15 to 20 year. So yeah, you don't really find out until later. And so being this early in top of funnel, you just have to have that many more swings for it. I don't know. It would just kind of like help pay back. I haven't done this calculation. Maybe you have, where, what would have been a fair, acceptable kind of like recoverable grant structure for Uniswap and 1inch and a few of the other protocols that came out of Gitcoin, that would have at the time felt totally fair to that project and Gitcoin. And then how much money was that in the end? And it could be that amount of money could have funded like all of Gitcoin operations.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
We should run that. We should make that spreadsheet.
Yeah. Carl Carbone from OSO did that analysis, and it just went up on the Gitcoin Gov forum. So shout out to Carl, but it would have been like 100 to 200x depending on how you set the assumptions. So
and 100 to 200x of the initial grant, or 100 to 200x or
of the initial grant. Yeah.
Yeah. And would that have funded? Like, I don't know what's the scale of that funding relative to Gitcoin's operations.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it would have been on the order of like $17 million.
Awesome.
If we had done that. So
for each one of those, or altogether?
Altogether, yeah.
Altogether.
So again, it depends on the assumptions and how you tune the assumptions, but on that order of magnitude.
Amazing.
Yeah.
I mean, that that is close to checking out, right? Like, I don't know how much Gitcoin has spent on operations relative. There's all of the funding that goes into the projects, but what is the operation budget? And that seems like pretty decent.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think going in that direction of taking upside in projects could be the way that we participate in the revenue focus in this upcoming cycle.
Yep.
Okay, I think we have time for one or two more questions. You in the center.
And I'm really optimistic about all the technology area happening here. But I can also a big part of NGOs, environmental NGOs. It is opportunity. How can we combine this technology also to implement the environmental and social crisis?
Yeah, so how can we use these technologies to respond to the environmental and social crises in Latin America? Was that the scope of the question?
Just
okay.
Yeah, I would say there's a whole community of people thinking about crypto and regenerative finance use cases for sustainability and the planetary boundaries framework. So this includes things like climate change, deforestation, overfishing, the destruction of like wild habitats. One of the graphs that I'm like most worried about is like this biomass graph that shows like wild animals greatly diminishing and like this massive extinction event that we're causing. Meanwhile, humans and livestock are like exploding in biomass size. Like if we're not careful, like we'll wipe out like I don't know what fraction of the how big the extinction rate is, but we're well on our way to producing the 7th largest extinction in the history of this planet. And so our impact might be like on the scale of like the meteor hitting the dinosaurs, like that degree. And so we really need to get our shit together here and stop that kind of change. One piece of fantastic news is that if you look at the energy production graphs, I don't know, some of you might have seen me posting about this on Twitter, but like solar is just scale. Like now that solar is below the cost of coal, which is an amazing achievement that took like, 20, 30 years to do. Now that that's happening, the ramp up in energy production of solar is fantastic to see. There's many countries already that have 30 or 50% of their energy being solar. Like that's super cool. And the ramp up graph looks so fast, especially in China, which is has been one of the biggest fossil fuel consumers in the last 10 years because they were sort of catching up. Their industrial revolution happened late relative to the rest of the world. There, the production, both solar and nuclear are massively scaling very quickly. And it shows that at least when it comes to climate change, even without the Kyoto Accord or the Kyoto Protocol, we're dramatically faster at getting there, thanks in great part to a bunch of the R&D subsidies that happened over the last 20 years. But now that we're here, where like the cost curve is where it is, we should be able to get off of fossil fuels, at least for a huge fraction of the activity over the next 10 to 20 years. And even the fossil fuels that we use might end up being just produced. Like there's like the Terraform Industries is a good example of like a project that is taking like synthesizing fuel like hydrocarbons out of CO2 in the air. So it's like net zero, which is super cool. It's not creating more emissions. It's just using the same emissions that are already in the atmosphere. Because there's a bunch of use cases where you actually need hydrocarbon fuel. So all of that to say, there's been tremendous progress in climate change. There's groups in the crypto community trying to get verifiable carbon credits, verifiable renewable energy credits, scaling those markets, being able to do better reforestation processes. There groups like Gainforest. There's also groups like Glow that are scaling the production of solar farms. Like that's a super cool thing. So there's a whole range of like networks that are applying a bunch of these primitives. We aren't yet looking at or thinking about problems like the wildlife habitat ones of how do we provide some like strong economic pressure to inhibit like the destruction of all these ecosystems. That's a really thorny, hard policy problem. I would say what I do think is that the crypto industry can provide an enormous amount of verifiability and public governance over a lot of these processes and systems. And so it would be amazing to see a bunch of these NGOs that have been working on these systems adopt these new financial primitives or these new governance primitives to improve their operations. Like what will be like the first NGO that operates at scale and is globally recognized to then start using crypto for, you know, a lot of their payment flows and puts all their finances on chain or something to be able to be auditable, or makes a governance of their members, like, you know, on chain with like on chain primitives. I don't know. That could be like an interesting thing. I do think that at the core of all these issues, there are strong economic principles at play here, and that we can't approach this just from a policy perspective of we have to agree not to do something. I just don't think that works. You have to use policy to shift the incentive landscape for everybody involved to make it the rational choice for all actors to do the right thing. So you can't ask people and enforce honest, non-rational behavior that just doesn't work at scale. It works to a point, but it like breaks down. You need to use policy to shift the incentive landscape to get the rational action to be as close as you can to the honest participant. And that's why solar is scaling. That's why we're probably going to get off of the climate change disaster. Is because we applied good subsidies to doing the R&D that produced a better energy flow. It wasn't because we convinced the oil companies to stop, you know, their bad behavior, or it wasn't because we convinced countries to like shoot their economies in the foot and like hold themselves back, right? Like the US and China pulled out of the accords, and, you know, the US YOLO'd into fracking, producing an enormous amount of oil. China also increased their emissions, but both of them are now scaling solar, and China's also scaling nuclear. And like that's some of the best news. And all of it comes down of thinking deeply about the economic structure and thinking deeply about how to apply policy to force the economic structure to be better. It wasn't just like, let's agree not to do the bad thing. It was, let's agree to fund the process that will make this the obvious next step for everybody involved.
Thanks, Juan. Hunt, how much more time do we have? Okay. Well, I think that we'll cut it here. Juan, thanks for your time, and we'll see everyone. What's next? Hey, Adam, MC. Okay. All right. Let's break for lunch, and we'll see you back in here at in 15 minutes. All right. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Juan.
Thank you for having me.